Praying in the Midst of Life, led by Ron Delbane, Episcopal priest, leader of workshops and retreats, popular author, spiritual director. He's been teaching people to pray for over 30 years.
Many of us believe that it's up to us to pray in a way that reaches God. I believe we are in the presence of God at all times, and prayer is being attentive to that presence. Where is God for you? Perhaps like me, you grew up thinking that prayer was like, "Hello, God, I know you're up there. I know you know all things, but I'd like to bring a few to your attention." It was as if our conversation was with a God up there. I've learned through my years of experience, not only in my own prayer life, but in sharing with others who come to me seeking companionship on their journey, that the most important question that influences our prayer life and journey is, where is God for you? This is one of the first questions I ask those who come to me seeking companionship on their journey.
I don't experience God in the traditional ways. It's hard for me sometimes to be in a worship service, for instance, and to experience God. For instance, the call to worship. Sometimes I can really identify with that. Sometimes I'm as far from that as the other side of the earth. To identify, I guess the best way to describe it is I experience God in moments, and probably when I don't expect to experience God.
I grew up with the traditional images of God the Father, the old gray-haired man on the throne. Mm-hmm. And while I didn't question them, they never quite seemed real.
I think I've spent a lot of my life being angry at God and not really understanding why. I spent a lot of time feeling that God was somewhere out there and I didn't know where that was, but it seemed like my life was separate from God. I kept trying to find God and did a lot of things to try and get close to God, and yet it seemed like, I think one of my deepest fears was that God didn't know who I was, that God did not know my name, that I might as well not exist for God, no matter what I did.
That's really scary.
It is.
Throughout the history of Christian spirituality, one of the primary images used to describe spiritual growth is the ladder. In fact, during the 6th and 7th centuries, there was a man by the name of John Climacus. He was a teacher who was trying to find a way to talk about spiritual growth. In fact, John's name, Climacus, means ladder. Pardon my rear. And John spoke about each one of the rungs of the ladder being part of the stages that we move through in order to reach our God. The concept of the ladder has moved into all parts of our culture. For example, how often do we talk about climbing the ladder in our work world? And so the ladder image has become attached to hierarchy, sexism, racism. In fact, what direction are you looking? Up. What direction am I looking? Down. It certainly gives the impression of who's more important. And then, of course, if we're climbing the ladder, competition becomes of primary importance. I'd like to suggest another image, and I think it's time to come down off the ladder. I've shared this image of the ladder with many people, and they tell me that it makes it easier for them to understand some of the shifts they're experiencing in understanding their relationship with God.
I remember when you were sitting up on top of that ladder telling us about the God up there. My neck hurt when I had to raise my head. And that started me to reflect myself about how the patriarchal God up there out there is not an image that's very helpful to me. A helpful image of God for me has been much more a grandmother who is sitting in a very large chair with a big, soft quilt, who invites me to come and sit with her in a place of great comfort. That has been a very nourishing image for me.
I guess as I've matured in my faith and matured physically and mentally, I don't so much see God as a picture or an image or a person, but qualities such as love and healing and wholeness. If I'm experiencing fear or anxiety, I may pray to a God and call God comforter or friend. When I'm feeling lonely also, I would probably refer to God as friend. When I'm angry or feeling hurt, I may just call God God. Or if I feel that I've been wronged and need someone to come to my defense, I may refer to God as protector.
We often experience a tension in talking about our relationship with God up there or here in our midst. In fact, the question, where is God, is an ageless question. We know that in the Hebrew Scriptures, which we commonly call the Old Testament, wherever we hear of a mountain, a hill, a large tower, God is doing something profound with humankind. The image that John Climacus, or John of the Ladder, picked up was Jacob's ladder. And yet we also have within the Hebrew Scriptures the story of God coming and walking in the garden at creation. God saying to Moses, I'm not up there. I am the God who is with you. I will be with you. And God was with the people in the pillar of fire and the cloud. And later on in their journeying, God said, pitch me a tent right in your midst, so that as you move from place to place and pick up your tents, pick up my tent as well and move it with you, so that no matter where you are, there I will be in the midst of you. However, when they reached Jerusalem and created the temple, then in a very real way, God became stationary. And then God chose to send the Word, who dwelt among us. And perhaps you're aware that the words which we translate dwelt among us from the beginning of John's Gospel really mean pitched his tent among us. And so Jesus becomes the new Word of God that pitches his tent right in our midst. And Jesus is a journeying person. As we are, as we journey from place to place, Jesus is in our midst. But we continue to live in that tension of where is God in our life, between the transcendent God and that God right here in our midst.
I have a friend who said, you Protestants are so preoccupied with God out there that you can never be attentive to God that comes to us and that's within us. And I suppose if there's any muscle of the Christian faith that I've tried to nurture the last 15 or 20 years, it was that muscle of being attentive to God in the midst of life and in the midst of my own life, to affirm that God is very present. And if there's any meaning to the incarnation, it seems to me that God is home with me and in me. And I also want to maintain some sense of transcendence, that God is calling some things into be that are not, and therefore I call to confess my sin. So I think they're both important ingredients, but the one that seems to me most missing in the Protestant tradition at least is more the sense of God being present, an immanent God, even in the world.
I understand transcendence not being spatial but being future. And so I see God as present as we are with one another, inviting us into the future, a future of love and grace. And so that image for me, the image of God is much more immediate rather than up there, because up is meaningless in a round world. I mean, the world's not flat. So out there may be more appropriate, but out there in the future, to me, is a more helpful image than a spatial image.
I mean, I remember meditating one day, and I had a picture, it's a woodcut, I think, of someone reaching up to heaven, and just you can see every muscle straining. I mean, this person's hand is open, just reaching up. And I thought, that's how I'm doing in my prayer and meditation. I'm just really reaching towards God. And in my meditation, so my face was up and my mouth was open, and this incredible amount of water was dumped on top of me. And I understood it to be God's way of saying, you are so silly. I mean, there is no reaching or straining. I'm here, and there's just so much grace and love waiting to fall upon you that you need to close your mouth or you will be drowned.
I know there have been times when I felt silly, and I suspect there have been times when you felt silly, looking outside of ourselves for that which was really only found within. There's no place to get. There's only a life to live. One of the images that helps me as I grow in my spiritual life is that of the tree. The ladder only going up, but the tree growing not only up, but out. If I buy an oak tree and plant it in my front yard, I don't go in the house and say, oh, I planted 1/8 of an oak tree in my front yard, just because its diameter was only 1 inch or 2. But rather, I know that whether a tree has a diameter of 2 inches, or 10 inches, or 20, or a foot, it's still a whole tree. That at any given moment, the tree is as whole as it can be at that very moment, and yet it is in constant growth. So that's why the bark of trees is generally cracked, so that it grows from the inside out. The other thing about trees is that we're firmly planted. Our roots go down into the earth. You may be aware that the Greek word for earth is humus, which is also the same root word from which we get our word humor. And so I'm reminded that as I move more deeply into the rootedness, in the earthiness of life, so too then I'm able to experience how silly I am at times in my life. So there is a time to be silly, a time to love, and a time to be profound in my spiritual life, just like the seasons of change in the tree. The image of the ladder suggests that God is in a place to which we must climb. The image of the tree suggests that God is where we are. The key is our attentiveness to that fact.
I had a recent event where I was driving very early to work one morning and down a deserted road, nobody before me or behind me, and all of a sudden a shower of gold leaves fell from the trees right in front of me, and then as I drove my car through, the leaves continued to just shower all over the car, and the tree just lost all its leaves right at that moment. And I thought how unusual it was that it should happen to be just as I passed, that 15 seconds earlier or later, and I never would have seen that. And for me, that was an awareness of the presence of God, because it just seemed like a gift. Here's just God just bestowing this wonderful thing. And I think that I will probably maintain that memory forever because it was so important to me.
Most of the time, my prayers aren't even verbal anymore. Most of the time, it's not, and I can tell you that it's not out there. I don't go to God in prayer anymore. If anything, I quiet my mind and my soul, and I just think about quiet things, and I allow myself to experience what I believe is God inside me. And it's not going out there somewhere as much as it is connecting with that still small voice, I guess, that is always there.
The magnificence of our God comes home to me when I'm aware of when God pitches the tent in the midst of our own hearts and minds. We experience it in such a unique and grace-filled way. Where is God for you is a question that not only each one of us answers for ourselves, but then we are also drawn to recognize how God has pitched the tent in the midst of all the people. And again, our key is the awareness of that fact. Where is God for you at this point in your life?
Right in the middle of everything that happens. Although sometimes that's hard to claim just because of the way we're raised and the culture around us that tries to move that somewhere else. My first trip to Nicaragua, when I'd studied about base Christian communities forever, read about them, interviewed folks, had folks in my house, but I wasn't really prepared for God in the midst of the people. I got up there and I was climbing up this road towards a little house, and there was no room left in the house where the base Christian community was meeting. I thought, that's okay, I'll just stand by the window, but there were chickens on the windowsill, and I tried to move them. And about that time, kids came running around chasing a pig, and then folks going by on the road waving to everybody else, saying, hello, how you doing? And I could feel this anger rising up in me about, I come all this way, spent 2 years getting ready for this 6 weeks with base Christian communities. I can't hear what's happening. And the man next to me said, it is good, is it not, to celebrate God's presence in the midst of the people. And I mean, I had forgotten what it means to celebrate God's presence in the midst of the people, which is never church like we're taught, where things are quiet and the doors are shut, and now you got a time for prayer and praise, but in the middle of everything.
It is good, is it not, to celebrate God's presence in the midst of the people? And we have the great joy, you and I, to know that Jesus has breathed life into us, and through the Spirit made us the new tents that are pitched in the midst of the people. And so you and I are the place where God has pitched the tent for those with whom we live and love and work and play, and that we are called to be attentive to the places where God is present in the midst of our life. So where is God for you? My hope for you is that you will become more and more aware of God's presence in the midst of your life. Here are some questions you may want to discuss. Someone can write them down for future reference. Have you experienced a shift in your understanding of God? Did you most identify with the ladder or the tree? What are ways you experience Jesus pitching his tent in your life?